There is a degree of relaxation that comes with that, is that the strategy is not just yours and not even from a business level. When you're a technology leader, I found that the company can only afford to have very few technology leaders, and there's a lot less advice for technology leaders. Like sales between different markets is a lot more similar than specific, like how do you build a tech stack between two different robotics companies, much less robotics and a SaaS company or a generic like B2C hardware company or something like that. And it's been very good to have a number of other technical leaders around we can compare notes with. That's been very helpful. Like it's been a lot of learning in a positive sense there.
Welcome back to Tank Talks. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, and we've got an incredible episode lined up for you today with Ryan Gariepy, the CTO and co-founder of Clearpath Robotics. Ryan's journey is a wild one. What started as a group of Waterloo friends hacking away on robots in a garage turned into Clearpath, a company that revolutionized the world of robotics back in 2009, and its eventual acquisition by Fortune 500 public company, Rockwell Automation, for a massive $600 million in 2023. In today's episode, we'll hear about the early days of Clearpath and when Ryan and his team realized they were onto something, and how the company scaled from a small startup to a global leader in the autonomous mobile robot space. We'll dive into how their open source work with the robot operating system changed the industry and what it took to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving space against giants like Google and others. We dig into some fascinating topics like how Clearpath built its robotics platform for industries ranging from factories to mines and military test ranges, and the evolution of talent in robotics and how the field is now matured with AI. Ryan also shares his perspective on the biggest barriers to humanoid adoption and what's next for the industry. Plus, we also get Ryan to dig into his leadership style, the myths about robotics, and his advice for Canadian founders looking to scale globally. This is a must listen for anyone interested in the future of robotics and how innovation in Canada can compete with the biggest players in the world. Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Ryan Gariepy from Clearpath Robotics. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Ryan.
Thank you very much for having me, Matt.
You know, Ryan, your story is one of what a lot of Canadian investors and operators only dream of. But, you know, for some of our listeners that don't know you and your story quite well, can you tell us a little bit about your journey, you know, where you grew up, your early professional background, before we get into the creation of Clearpath Robotics?
Sure, absolutely. I grew up in Barrie, Ontario, just north of Toronto, although many people are familiar with it as the place where all the traffic stops on the way to Cottage Country. I wasn't really involved in robotics at that point. There wasn't really much robotics to speak of. Things like First Robotics or Vex Robotics competitions, they just weren't there. I think it's doing a little bit better now, but it didn't have much exposure. I went to school for mechatronics engineering at the University of Waterloo. While I was there, I got involved with the UW robotics team. Waterloo has a very, very famous co-op program. So I did a lot of co-op programs or a lot of interesting co-op placements there. I worked for Honda Alliston, where I started to get up to speed when I think I was about 18 years old with what is needed for industrial automation. And then a few other things. I was one of the first co-op students for Kiva Systems, which is at the time was a 30-person startup and is now Amazon Robotics. So that's kind of changed a little bit, I believe. And I worked for Area Labs, which was one of the first drone startups around and another Canadian success story. And from there, I decided that the first full-time job, along with some of my friends from school, was to start a robotics company. Founded robotics companies, and at all, they are not foundable at the time. They were not fundable at the time, and they're kind of hard, but we decided to do one anyway. And that was my first full-time job, and I am still there.
What drew you to robotics in the first place? I assume you probably like to play around with, you know, toys like robots, little tinky things like that, but like what really drew your passion into it, you know, and when did you see your first Boston Dynamics video that blew your mind, I'm sure?
I think I predated the Boston Dynamics videos that were blowing people's minds. What got me into it was first, I loved Lego. I loved sci-fi as a kid. So the Star Trek, Star Wars, all of that stuff. Concept of space exploration was cool. And that was something that Canada has a unique presence in when it comes to space robotics. And all of that stuff said, let's find a program where I actually learn how to build a robot, because I didn't know any of that in high school or elementary school. I wasn't exposed to any of that.
Your friends obviously had the same passion because you guys, the four of you, started, you know, as Waterloo grads building basically the first iteration of Clearpath in a garage. When did you guys kind of realize you were onto something? Because as you said, it wasn't really fundable. It was hard tech, right? When did you guys think it was the right time to go all in?
I can't think back to the time when there was like a binary switch where I said, this is the time to go all in. It was just, we decided to sell a little bit of stuff. We closed some simple deals. It was like $6,000 for a remotely operated boat, I believe, to UW, and then said, okay, well, maybe we should incorporate around now. So we didn't actually incorporate until we sold our first bit of vaporware. And then we just kept going. And there wasn't a point where any of us, I think, really sat down and said in or out. It just kept getting bigger and carrying us along with it. Now I'm here. Yeah, it wasn't this decision point. And I know that probably wasn't the best move, but we were young and we were stupid. So, but there wasn't really a decision point, at least for me, where I said, okay, in or out. It would just felt like this was something I must do for something I was interested in or obligations to my co-founders or to the rest of the team that eventually we hired, and that got bigger and bigger. And eventually it was also like, what else am I going to do? This
Right.
seems not the worst idea.
You started at a time, I think, when a lot of the kind of startups were getting started were like, hey, we just came out of the global financial crisis. There wasn't a lot of people that were hiring. What's the worst thing is we get to work on some pet projects and raise a little bit of angel funding, maybe get some grants as well, being in, Waterloo. But I assume when you raised like that first Series A round, maybe in 2014, 2015, then it was the real kind of commitment time for you guys. Like, what was it like between like the early start of 2010 until you raised more meaningful capital later in 2014, 2015?
Well, we were all just still trying to figure out, and I don't think this was just us, by the way. I think it was the industry trying to figure out what was happening. I remember going to a number of robotics shows at the time. We were commonly at this show called Robo Business. And that's where everyone who was trying to make robots for business was actually going. You wouldn't find robotics companies at a CES or an Automate or MineXpo or any of these actual serious shows. It just wasn't a place for them. The markets were not ready. The people were not ready. So we were all, I think it just wasn't us. It was everyone was trying to figure out how to make this stuff work. There was this vast chasm between the traditional robotics companies like a Fennec or a KUKA or something like that, and everyone else who was trying to apply newer technology. And I think that actually brought this community together, these various smaller conferences, whether it was those or some of the academic conferences where people are coming out of academia and saying like maybe more is possible than what we're seeing.
What gravitated the business towards auto, right? The self-driving vehicle you guys eventually created that was really designed for material handling within the research and industrial environment space. Obviously, it's what led you to the eventual acquisition, I believe, with Rockwell. But can you take us back to that time where like you decided what the use case was really to focus on?
We always knew that we wanted to start in research and kind of bootstrap our way to technology, team, and solid business, and then go from there to find these next verticals that we could work with. It was actually an inspiration when I worked at Kiva, hearing the story about how they found these ideas but didn't have a way to build the robots for them. We were saying like we were pretty confident that there was going to be more verticals where people wanted robotics. It turns out we were kind of right on that. We were looking at really the intersection of where researchers were getting bored and industrial companies were getting excited. So because we were and are still one of the largest companies to work with researchers, we were looking at those areas where they were starting to say, this is a solved problem. I mean, it's not usually a solved problem, but at least they were thinking it's a solved problem. And that meant that the technology readiness level was something where a small company was able to really invest. And at the same time, we were also looking for other trends. So we were starting to see market pull in a few areas. One was a retail inventory tracking was a big one. There was also hydrometric or a bathymetric surveying was another one. There were obviously people were talking about self-driving cars at the time, but we decided not to get into that because we couldn't look our team and our shareholders in the eye and say we knew how to solve this problem. Obviously, the big one was industrial production logistics. And then we also looked a lot at mining. Mining was another big topic. So it was a of what is the readiness of the technology, what is the market size, what is the value chain that we'd be part of, what's the go-to-market strategy, like do we have the mentors and contacts needed to get into these spaces. There's a whole lot of different things that we decided to go down. And if I look back, I'm sure there were many other companies trying to make similar decisions, and I think we made the right call.
I absolutely did. But I was going to ask you, you had a bunch of strategic investors, on the cap table. You had Caterpillar Ventures, GE Ventures, obviously Leo Susan from Eclipse Ventures. How much impact did your investors have in terms of the direction they were pushing you towards? Or was that all driven internally and then just validated by some of the strategic investors you had around the table?
We didn't really do the Series A until after we had identified that first market hypothesis. So our investors from the Series A on out were bought into the industrial logistics play that we were talking about doing. And that you can imagine that's why GE was at the table with our A and Caterpillar was at the table with our B and Hyundai was at the table for our C, was because this was aligned. We
That's
didn't have
pretty cool.
pricing or anything like that.
Well, you guys went from, grads in Waterloo grads in a garage to Rockwell Automation, $600 million deal for Clearpath and Automotos. What was that like, on the inside? How did sort of it change your life, I guess, having such a tremendous outcome for you, obviously being from the very beginning of the journey to the very end? Must have been pretty monumental, I'd say the least.
First, I'll say as we're both Canadians in this podcast, and this is a very Canadian podcast, I'll say that in fairness, we should price that in Canadian dollars, which makes it about 800. The journey through the acquisition was, I would say, transformational in a number of ways. Like everything that I learned through that process is something that's an experience that's very difficult to buy. It was certainly a test, and I'm proud that I made it through the test to the point that a bunch of those people who were testing me are now my coworkers and colleagues. I don't think anything had really prepared me for that. And I know Matt has, had through similar experiences, but for example, going into a technical due diligence call where there's one of me and there's 50 of them, there's 50 people from Rockwell, and I think like Goldman Sachs was there and EY, and there was a whole bunch of other people on the other line. And I didn't know what questions they were going to ask. Like it was just like technical follow-up. And there's no cues on what's going to ask. And like anyone can be asking you any question. And this is like, let's say the full fate of the company was resting on it. We would have found other ways forward. That's a lot of pressure. And then I look back and realize that it was a very fast process. It felt like an eternity going through it, but we got the term sheet in May of 23. The agreement was signed in August, like everything done, signed in August, and it was closed October of 23. Stepping back, I'm like, I have no idea how we got all of that done and still managed to keep selling and developing and building and shipping robots. And it's a huge credit to the entire team for doing so, especially because 95% of the company had no idea this was happening.
That is fantastic. 95% of the company didn't know what's happening. You were wearing the weight of the
People
shoulders.
total were in the circle of silence.
Yeah. That's sort of inside of what it's like going through technical due diligence. Not a lot of people, they want to experience it, but they don't know exactly how grueling it is until they actually sit in that hot seat like you did, negotiating almost $1 billion transaction. Did you have advisors and like M&A advisors also coaching you through as Goldman was on the other side representing Rockwell?
Yeah, we were represented by Evercore, which is one of the largest banks that's no one's ever heard of. So,
well, I don't know nobody. They're pretty well known, but yeah, maybe not outside of
in your circle,
circles.
I can guarantee you, no one's heard of them.
Okay.
Outside of like the VC funding circle.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so they were representing us. They were a really great partner along the way. Stella, who's the managing director there, was great. She had some previous experience. She was also sell side for Fetch Robotics when they sold to Zebra. And then, of course, we had our board of directors and other advisors through that. Well, at that point, it was just the board. Yeah, just the board was involved at that and never. But there was a lot of advice and a lot of help from everyone who was able to be involved.
And just to be clear, like Rockwell is not a small company, right? I mean, $35 billion market cap. They're a massive, massive business, based out of Milwaukee, I believe, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
27,000 employees. What was it like after the acquisition closed for you on the integration side? Like what challenges did you and your team face on that front? And what sort of advice would you have for somebody going into, a Fortune 500 giant after you come from a scrappy Canadian scale up post acquisition?
So I'd say that an important thing, and I'd gone through this during COVID for other reasons, but an important thing is to separate your own self-image from your own company. And an experienced person, if you're like a serial entrepreneur or whatever, you've probably done that. Like this is just another company. That's not the case for a first-time founder. And it's important to go through that journey. Your company is going to change. The company will either fail, the company will grow tremendously, and then it will be out of your control. It will be bought and then be out of your control. All of these things are likely to happen. Like odds are one of those things will happen if you're a startup. If you're a venture funded startup, it's even higher odds, like something like 4 nines or 5 nines worth of probability that one of the happen. The sooner you can separate, I think, that sort of mental self image from your own company, then the just the better it is. It certainly did work out. As I walked into the company, was knowing that I'm going to be an employee. This is what it is. And there's a lot, I'm relatively senior, all told, but I'm still an employee. And other people will come up with the strategies and I may disagree with them, but that's what they are. And I'll say that there is a degree of relaxation that comes with that, is that the strategy is not just yours and not even from a business level. When you're a technology leader, I found that, the company can only afford to have very few technology leaders, and there's a lot less advice for technology leaders. Like sales between different markets is a lot more similar than specific, like how do you build a tech stack between two different robotics companies, much less robotics and a SaaS company or a generic like B2C hardware company or something like that. And it's been very good to have a number of other technical leaders around we can compare notes with. That's been very helpful. Like it's been a lot of learning in the positive sense.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, you're still wearing the CTO hat, technically speaking. What kind of keeps you up at night post acquisition now? Is it product roadmaps? Is it still post merger integrations? What is it that kind of keeps you in that sort of uncomfortable state, I guess?
The big thing for me is that there's opportunity. Like there's so much opportunity in robotics and in robotics in general. I think everyone's starting to realize
Is
there's
this
some.
the most exciting time in your career for robotics? Because it
It,
definitely
it
feels like the
absolutely is,
resurgence
and
is insane.
it absolutely is, and not just like my career. Like speaking to people who have been in the field since before I was born, they've also said this is the most exciting time in their career. So it's not just like me being, survivor biased or what have you here. But the biggest thing that keeps me up tonight at night, so to speak, is that there's so much opportunity here, and I just want to do my part to make this a reality. Really.
That's fantastic. I mean, you are doing your part as well with the launch of the Open Source Robotics Alliance, OSRA. So basically, for our listeners in plain English, what problem is the Alliance actually fixing?
The Alliance is a follow-on, or actually a program of the Open Source Robotics Foundation, which is a nonprofit, actually it's a charity technically, that's been around since 2012, have been on the board since 2012. And that's the mission there, is to further the use and adoption of open source robotics. So whether that's the algorithms or tools or simulation systems or anything like that. And what we recently did as part of a general like restructure and strategic changes to create this alliance that allows companies to come in and to contribute money and guide a little bit the direction formally of the OSRF. And that's important because as things like the robot operating system and a number of these other tools are increasingly critical to a number of these companies, and it's important that we continue to make them easier and easier to use and more solid and things that people can rely on, so that we can get more robots out there, we can get more robot companies out there and things like that.
Silly question. Do drones fall underneath robotics in
They do.
they do, right? Like, did you watch the Anduril announcement, obviously, with the shooting down of like the 10,000 drones flying at those people, and how many people thought it was
That was,
fake or CGI?
that was just like a kind of played up jamming system, if I
Right.
remember that.
That's what it looked like.
Yeah.
Hasn't that been around for like quite some time?
Jamming drones for a while, since they've been used in warfare originally. I don't know how real that is, because at the same time, drones are a lot more robust to being jammed. Offhand, I short of an actual electromagnetic pulse, I can't think of any drone that's going to be good enough to use in military environments that simply drops out of the sky when you jam it. I'm pretty sure the DJI quadcopter that I bought on sale from Amazon or whatever will not do that. So I'm really sure. I mean, there's a
Three
lot
main
of,
criteria for a military drone is one of them is anti-jamming.
yeah, or at least don't do stupid stuff when you are jammed. Yeah.
Or you think about the Spaceballs clip where we've been jammed, strawberry jam. Yeah, that's a funny clip. Okay, I want to ask though, robotics, again, it's such a hot topic now. We are seeing a lot more of these videos of obviously, humanoid robots out there and a lot more, versatility and to be frank, like a lot more scary attributes of what these things can actually do in the factory, in the field, and in everyday life in people's homes. How are you staying ahead of the curve while also not getting distracted by all the opportunities possible in today's age.
Staying ahead of the curve versus not getting distracted.
It's like chasing all the shiny objects of opportunities out there because there's so many things happening in the space. It must be pretty daunting at sometimes because you can do everything, but you also got to focus.
Yeah. How do you find that balance between focus and exploration? Having perspective helps a little bit on this. I've given some talks on this before where I talk about everything that used to be called AI and is now just something that is used in robotics. The thing that keeps me in there's, I think, two things that keep me sane in terms of not feeling that I have to like always be spending all my time catching up to stuff. The first is that having been in the field for now a reasonable amount of time, I'm not going to say a long time because might offend some of my friends who have been in the field since a long time. But having been in the field a reasonable amount of time, it becomes less overwhelming to see a new article. It's not like it's not like some random VC or PE person has just learned how to spell the word robot and is now trying to catch up on 30 plus years of development. Like I've already done that. So for me, a day that passes in robotics is just another day, if that makes sense. The other thing is some perspective of the amount of times that someone has said, oh, this algorithm, this sensor, this development is going to change the world tomorrow. Odds are they always come into play. They're always useful, but none of them have completely disrupted how robots are built or how they're programmed or how they're interacted with. It's going to be like 10 years from now, how you program one is going to be substantially different from now versus 10 years ago. So I'm not saying that things aren't going to change, but let's look at even LLMs, like LLMs and transformer models. Like this is the word du jour, right? Of something that's going to change everything. But if I remember right, the SACAN paper, which was the first foray of this into robotics, was 2022. And LLMs existed for a period of time before that, and in research even more before that. And we're still not seeing a real point where we can point at some field anywhere and say, this is the adoption curve of robotics is substantially different because of LLMs, or that every system out there has an LLM built in and it's mission critical. Like they're absolutely used. And we're looking at them. We're looking at every piece of technology that's out there. That's also, part of my responsibility is to be aware of all these trends at a much longer time horizon than I was ever able to be as a startup. But that's kind of what keeps me sane on this stuff. There's always something new coming out, and the responsibility of not just myself, but any roboticist is to say, like, what are the pros and cons? Where is it fragile? Is it ready? Is it intensely power hungry? Any of these things, and where do we bring that in? And Humanoids is just that on steroids, really.
Yeah, you sound very first principles focused, like a realist towards all these things, because you have been around for a while. And I've heard you say like only 10% of early roboticists could write production grade code. How has the talent pool changed though since you've entered the industry?
Yeah, that's a lot higher now. When we started, it was no one could write production grade code, and which was okay because none of your customers actually cared about that either. Well, now actually, a roboticist is not just someone with a master's degree or PhD. When I entered the field, the vast majority of people writing code for robotics only came from a master's program or a PhD or some sort of graduate program in robotics. So they didn't have any other background, and then they might go into a company where it's much like the blind leading the blind. It's people who were similar. Now, when we look at robotics, it's a lot more variety. There's a lot more people coming in from other industries, whether it's cloud computing, whether it's gaming, high performance computing, just general systems engineering, safety critical systems, automotive engineering. People are getting interested in bringing what they know in. And that's really allowed the average company's code base and quality of work to keep going up. And to be something that people can now trust the robots to do actual real work too.
Well, it's also being proven in sort of the speed at which we're seeing a lot of stuff being built because there's just higher quality roboticists writing production grade code more and more coming from multitude of industries, not just from grad schools. But looking back, what was Clearpath's most underrated early hire and why? For other founders to think about when they're maybe only looking for one archetype? Where were you going in thinking this is not going to be such an important hire, but it ended up changing big part of Clearpath's progress?
That's an interesting question because I think there's certain hires that we would make that we thought were always going to be important that other people might disagree with or vice versa. I'm having a hard time thinking about a hire where we're like, oh, let's make this hire, but not really too convinced. And then it turned out really well.
Well, it doesn't have to be on the product side. I mean, I know your product, but it could have been on the go-to-market. It could have been on partnerships. It could have been on strategy.
Yeah. I mean, even thinking through it, like one of the things when you're an early founder, you don't have the luxury of just making a hire that you're not entirely, as a founding team, that you're not entirely convinced on. So I think maybe there was some that slipped through the cracks just because we weren't actively convinced on it. But something that I've said to people, there's always a need and we started doing this fairly early, was always trying to bring in people who had other background, who were just happy building something cool, and they were not necessarily trying to join the hockey stick of a startup. They're just they've just been heads down working on some aspect of technology for 20 or 30 years, and they just want to keep doing that. And they're not the ones who's telling you, oh, you need to adopt this brand new piece of tech, you need to do this, you need to do that innovative thing. Because in the end, like, as an early startup, there's only so many people who are going to do that. And odds are the founders are going to be the ones doing all that aggressive stuff. Even from early days, just going outside the university bubble or what have you, or the startup bubble, and bringing some people in who just want to put their heads down and build something. That was something that helped us out a great deal.
Clearpath was also the first company I read that monetized ROS. Now ROS2 is also mainstream. What was sort of the hardest parts with migrating legacy tech stacks when you guys were starting to sell this thing?
I will let you know when we are finished on migration. That's just part of engineering, the way I look at it. There's always something that's being migrated. There's always, you're migrating an Ubuntu version, you're migrating. It was a pain as we were halfway through launching Auto, trying to find a product market fit. We're also struggling with the Python 2 to 3 migration. Even at a smaller scale, there's always some, I don't know, some Django migration that's coming up or something on the smaller scale. I mean, that's just, I guess, engineering management. You say there's engineering management, there's always some, for lack of a better term, supply chain disruption. And some of those supply chain disruptions are needing to move to a new version of a framework. And some of those supply chain disruptions were what we dealt with over COVID. And I can say, as someone who had to deal with both of them, I will take soccer supply chain disruptions any day of the week.
Really? Okay, so let's go
Oh,
through that time.
the
Like
first thought,
supply
no.
chain disruptions were huge, obviously during COVID. You know, Rockwell lives and dies by its supply chain, but also so do your customers,
Yeah.
right? So how did you manage that time? And what were you seeing as sort of a light at the end of the tunnel that got you through it?
Something just to make sure the timelines are clear for everyone is that we were not acquired until after the supply
Right.
chain went down. So we were not able to rely on any of Rockwell's balance sheet or skills or supplier relations through the entire thing. But I would say that it was a side benefit of choosing the market that we did, which is manufacturing. And in particular, we were pretty heavy in automotive at the time because that's generally where a lot of manufacturing robotics goes first. And a surprise benefit during the supply chain crisis is that a lot of our customers understood what we were going through because they were going through the exact same thing. So we had to deal with all sorts of dealing with, where are these chips actually coming from? Are they gray market? Are they actually the right part? There were situations like we would get reels of parts and not every one was the same. Some of them would be legit chips coming from the right manufacturer. Some would be gray market or black market stuff. So it was just a constant game of whack-a-mole. And I would say that it did come in out of left field, not in terms that it might happen, but just the effect of it. I don't think we ever shorted on computers, for example. I don't think we really shorted on them. The first thing I remember us running into shortages of was power cables. There's literally no processing in them. It's copper surrounded by rubber. And it was just some random upstream factor that caused the power cables to be shorting on, or shorting on power cables. And it was just random stuff that was coming up left, right, and center. I think it's very important to that point to always have some understanding of, building, buying, or partner. We were heavily vertically integrated at the time, both in terms of software and hardware. And we did so because at the time, when we started All of Auto, nobody really cared about robots. So we had to do a lot of this stuff ourselves. But now I think that's something else for people to take into account when you're vertically integrating is, sure, you can build a motor controller yourself, but that means that you now need to be accountable for, let's say, 200 components from, the PCBs all the way through the passives and the processors and everything, on bus bars, all the different parts that might go into a motor controller. But if you're dealing with a upstream supplier, you can just say, you owe me a motor controller or migrate to another motor controller. There's pros and cons of each, but it's important to go into that eyes open. Like a large auto manufacturer may choose to vertically integrate, but on the other hand, they have the ability to track all of those parts and to manage all of these various supply chains. And I've definitely seen that now from the inside, that like the Rockwell integrated supply chain team is very good at managing the life components.
Did you guys re-onshore stuff? Did you build on, different suppliers during COVID to save you during that downtime or shortage? Like, how did you get through those 12 to 18 months with supply chain disruptions?
Our margins did not go the best during that time, along with everybody else. Like the costs went up significantly. Fortunately, we sell a premium product. We were not a company that is, selling toys or anything like that. We're selling a premium product to enterprise customers who appreciate that. It was not a pleasant thing, but we had flex. And we also had a really good team who was able to re-engineer a number of these boards very quickly. We had, favorable relationships with a number of our suppliers, so like laser scanners being another one where we have a very good set of laser scanner partnerships, and I don't believe we were ever shorted on those. So part of that is also the supply relationship that we had before COVID. It would still be like 13 odd years pre-COVID for some of these suppliers. We'd worked with them for a long time. It was
Mhm.
not we had come in as a startup and then 2 years later we were their least favorite supplier. Like a lot of our, suppliers value consistent customers, and that's what we were.
I think that's interesting. Like now you're seeing it from within Rockwell and how deep their supply chain goes. Do you think you would have ever been able to get anywhere near that level of sophistication without being inside of a Rockwell? Like how big of a gap is that between what a
Oh, it's
ClearPath?
it's a it's a huge like Rockwell has its own factories to build up things similar to what we do, right? All the PLCs, like for example, PLC manufacturing and a number of the other things that Rockwell makes are fully vertically integrated. That's actually one of the reasons when it came down to having these conversations about, acquisition versus continuing on our own was realizing like on a personal level what excites me, what I like doing, and what stresses me out. And one of the things that does not excite me was the concept of having to build out these global operations to do all of these things. That's something that everyone has done. There are thousands of companies who have figured this out. It was not a good use of like my time, my life, or our investors' capital to be the thousandth and first person to build out a new set of factories that does this. And that just didn't
Totally.
be the right, with everything else coming together, that just didn't seem to be the right play.
No, absolutely. Scale definitely has an impact, especially in hard tech spaces like this. Now, as you mentioned, we are seeing this robot as a platform, robot as a service wave finally here. And it's probably the most exciting time in your career. What niche application, though, would you build if you had a weekend to hack it out on an auto base?
Does it have to make money at
No,
all? Nah.
no, there has to be no like revenue associated with it in the beginning. It would just be something you want to see working in the wild.
I haven't had much time personally yet to play around with like vision language action models or something like that. But I would just probably just build one for my place. Just usually just start by having something like that just finds my cat just for fun. Although he probably wouldn't like that. He hates the Roomba. But just something to play around with on that side. There's not a lot in my personal life where I'm saying, you know what, I need a robot for that. But that's
Okay.
because I'm in a condo these days. I'm sure if I still lived in suburbia, I'd like talking about all sorts of like snow clearing robots and lawn clearing robots and all sorts of stuff like that.
Listeners, the pitch on why autonomy inside like a plant will beat autonomy on like public roads for mass deployment right now.
At this point, we almost have the existence proof, right? Waymo is starting now to scale and they are doing tremendous work. And I really respect all the things the Waymo team has done, but it's taking like this point, I don't know if I'm going to guess somewhere between 10 and $50 billion to do so, which is more, I would guess, for that one company, more money than has gone into possibly like more money that's actually been invested to like robotics in factory robotics, period. I would like if it's more than the entire market cap of all these companies.
Is that because of predictability, structure, and sort of rigidness of a plant versus all the variabilities that just come into the real world deployments of cars and people and driving?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a
Yeah.
very hard operational design domain. You've got the weather, you've got the speeds, you've got the pedestrians, you've got the regulatory environment,
Hmm.
you've got all these different things that are in play, and it's jumping right to hard mode. And on top of it, there is also this challenge where it's like what value is being provided. Like it's non-zero value being provided to get home safely, to be able to sleep in a cab, instead of drive yourself or things like that. Or sorry, sleep in a car instead of drive yourself. But it's not nearly the same amount of value per kilometer driven or per hour in operation as is provided by a factory robot. So that's the other, like from a business model perspective, it's also more questionable.
The economics are not there yet, but you have to also think about the application layers that can be built on top of it once that base has been solved for. That I think is probably, you're right, another 100 billion away from being solved for. But it's like that sort of the robo taxi that is owned by an individual as a supplemental income source.
I don't see that ever happening. Well, you've got the cleaning thing, for example. So if you own your car, and are you just going to trust that random people keep it clean, or are you going to sell it out? Are you going to rent it out, or are you going to have to rent it out to, yes, this magic, like whatever Tesla network or whatever that Elon was talking about, and then have to like contract a cleaning service before you use it again. I'm aware that things like Lyft and Uber exist, for example, but like I'm just really not convinced on the economics. I'm really not. Like there's so much, it's been a race to the bottom here. We will get more robo taxis out there. I think a way to look at them is closer to like a privatized public transport than it is an individual renting out their car.
Interesting. I would love to have like Dara sit down and talk with you through his vision and mission for it versus what you think is economically viable for as a shareholder, for example, of Uber, because maybe they would not intersect. But I want to ask you, which emerging sensor or AI models have you the most excited for the next generation of robotics?
On the sensor side of things, I am most excited for depth cameras that do not suck. I don't think we're there quite yet, but something that's like predictable and you can just trust it. I think a lot of people, they're still trying to apply like pure software engineering to robotics, and they're not realizing exactly how big leaky abstraction layer the physical world is. They're just assuming you can take a camera feed and all camera feeds are the same or all depth feeds are the same or anything like that. And just reviewed this video internally where we did a check of not even a depth camera, but actually just a traditional industrial spinning 2D LiDAR made by a very reputable company. And we found that the plane of the LiDAR was off by some degrees. The technology has been around for 40 plus years. It's supposedly trustable, and it costs thousands of dollars for these units. Cameras are hard and sensors are hard. And I would very like the better they are, the cheaper they are, that'd be just wonderful to have them so that you don't have to worry about things like calibration. You don't have to worry about quality. You don't have to worry about noise as nearly as much. As for the models, there's a lot of large language models, small language models that are coming in place right now. It would be very interesting to see some which are like reasonably small, like a few billion parameters that can, run on device and could actually unlock specifically the human robot interaction. I think there's a lot to be done with human robot interaction, and not just the notional household robot, but just the robots operating in factories and other commercial environments. And that's something we've lacked. That's one of the things that excites me most about these large language models, we'll just say GPTs, is the ability to bridge context, like bridge the gray areas of how humans communicate to each other versus what the specificity of what is underlying a robot stack. And I'd really like to unlock that, because I think there's a big thing holding us back from broad robotics adoption is just general ease of use.
Really, I didn't think we were that far off from like conscious robotics being able to interact in a factory. I thought like NVIDIA was already talking about this, these small multi-billion or several billion parameter models running on a conscious robot of sorts. Didn't seem that far off. Is that what you're saying?
I think we've still got a while off. There's a lot of people are talking about how this is going to unlock, humanoids, for example, but it's not just about the typical, like a long-term or a very old term for this was learning by demonstration or teaching by demonstration, what have you, where you just kind of show it to do something and then it would do something. But that doesn't fully teaching is, right? And teaching specifically in these complex industrial environments, like it's a feedback. You're not just saying, oh, do this, and then it does something. Like that's just a version of a teach pendant, which we've had for robots since the...
yeah. This is the sanctuary AI sort of thesis. And you're saying it's still far off.
I mean, it's very cool. And we've seen a lot of developments recently on the ability to learn from videos and things like that. But what about the correction? Like, how do you get that correction to stick, for example? How do you get to introspect that correction? There's also been a lot of videos where, and I think people are starting to find these things like this notional chain of thought concepts, right? In any sort of, Chat GPT or Claude or whatever, where it's supposedly explaining what it's doing, but it's not. Like that is also a falsification, or I'm not going to say, well, maybe not the wrong term. That is also generated. It happens to correlate well with the action that gets taken. It's not like we've cracked explainability yet. So there's a lot of things we still don't know about this. But the good news is that for something like basic human robot interaction of existing robots, whether it's a Roomba, whether it's a factory, like a forklift or robot arm, or what have you, we don't need to really go down that path. We don't need, human intelligence. But at the same time, it's nice to be able to just ask a robot what it's doing and what you can do to fix it. That's well within our grasp. And I think we're very close to that.
Yeah. It goes back to what you were saying earlier, like your very first principles focused on like the now and what you can implement today, rather than what sort of like has single use applications, but you throw one variable at it that's pretty common in the field, and it just doesn't know how to handle it.
It's great to try to generalize everything. And that's what we are fundamentally trying to do, that as much as possible. And I believe that's the direction we're going to go in. But it's about building foundations. It's about saying that, if you're in a company that's just filled with fax machines, maybe jumping to the smartphone is not something you can do right now. So it's good to have that long-term vision, but it's also good for that vision to have some steps, some steps along the way. If we're talking about, for example, transformer models completely modernizing everything, well, then a very good existence proof would be putting the entire AMR field out of business. And nobody's doing that, right? These things are so great for localization, for control, for introspectability. Show me the AMR, the industrial mobile robot, powered by this, that is completely wiping the floor with everyone in terms of safety and performance. And it's not there right now. If it is there, then we'll learn. And I'm sure at some point it will be there. But it's that point, like you've got to bring everything together. It's not just one algorithm. I think anyone who's sufficiently cynical about machine learning knows that the writing the algorithm is the easy part. It's everything else around it that's the hard part.
It's like the buyer's remorse people are feeling now from all this prototype AI stuff that they were buying because they needed it. But then exactly as you say, in the field, it doesn't hold up to the test. But they needed to try it out and see if it works. But that's because they generalized a lot of the use cases. Clearpath's acquisition story is pretty legendary, from a Canadian startup perspective. What's one of the biggest myths founders probably believe about your journey that is definitely not true and is a myth that they should know about exits, when building a startup in Canada?
About exits in general?
Mm-hmm. Through
I
your
mean,
experience.
yeah, I'm only like a sample of one here, but generally that they just happen. There's stories out there, this exit that just someone writes a check. It's like Facebook acquiring Instagram or what have you, or like whatever just happened with Windsurf. That's the exception, not the rule. And well, acquisition itself is the exception, not the rule. And then beyond that, the acquisition who comes in because some mercurial billionaire or CEO just said, let's buy this company. That's the exception to the exception. So I think it's good to know that, in the end, just keep building the business, keep being connected to people. Don't hesitate to go out there and network with large companies in this case, and it'll put you in a good position. We'd actually never done business with Rockwell up until the acquisition. That was the first check they wrote to us as a company was a biggie, but they were still aware of us and we were aware of each other. And that had been the case for many, many years. So just making sure you're out there in the industry, making sure that you're connected, you're talking about partnerships is a big deal.
I totally agree. I always say to our founders, great companies are bought, not sold. And so that is definitely something that things just do not happen. Yeah, you're not getting called up from Zuck, as the founder of Instagram. It's like, you want 1 billion, 2 billion? Like, what are we going to do here? It's a Friday. I want this done by Monday. Yeah, I don't think so. Well, before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
I don't actually listen to podcasts, so that one's an easy one.
You don't listen to anything in your ear, just rock and roll?
Just music. Yeah.
Just music. Okay. What kind of music?
There's classic rock. There's power metal. There's Celtic music.
Celtic. Okay.
There's Broadway show tunes. It's a mix. Yeah.
All right. So every day of the week.
There's an AI agent on the other side of my Spotify profile that is very confused.
I'm sure it is. Your what is it at the end of the year? Your rundown? It must be pretty interesting to see that.
It's my daily playlists are very interesting. There's probably like an H100 dedicated to figuring out what exactly.
Okay, perfect. Next is your favorite newsletter or blog.
Favorite newsletter or blog? I would go with the IEEE Automaton blog.
What is that about?
So it's robots. It's just,
I had a feeling, but specifically?
No, there's a new one. It's everything from random research to new robots being released, new products being released, and that was great.
Do you think you'll start
very realistic yet exciting view on the world?
You're co-chair of the Canadian Robotics Council, right? You see a lot of things. Do you ever think you'll start your own blog?
I mean, maybe now I'll just keep feeding these sorts of things into some random transcription service and then have it start spitting things out. But I try to have a semi-personal approach to things like LinkedIn. But
nice. Your next is your favorite tech gadget.
My favorite tech gadget. Okay. If big counts, my car it would count as a tech gadget, I think.
What car is it?
That would be a Porsche Taycan. And then if we're going small, I have a folding phone and a folding keyboard that have been really great. I like to just go and work in different places in like coffee shops or cocktail bars or something like that without carrying a ton of stuff with me. So the folding phone and keyboard, I can just work from wherever.
Do you hook the folding keyboard up to the folding phone, or you don't need to do that?
Yeah, it's Bluetooth. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Okay, next is your favorite new trend.
Like robots is kind of a new trend, I
Sure.
guess.
Yeah, yeah. What
Yeah,
specifically
I
about
think we're
robots
just
now?
if I'm gonna be more specific, yeah, we're just running with the theme of that. It's not just robots because robots have been a little bit of a trend for a while. It's been recently more of a focus on robots actually solving problems that will help people. We talked about self-driving cars, but really like that's a convenience factor. It's a lot of money poured into a convenience factor. You can't even argue safety, honestly, for that. Like robots for construction and for farming and for manufacturing. There's a lot of people who work these very hard jobs. Well, people like you and I just sit in offices and kind of tap at keyboards all day. It's something that's very exciting to me to see that all of these jobs are getting easier, that we're getting more capable kind of as a society along the way.
And obviously safer, which is great as well. Uh,
Yeah.
Next is your favorite book.
That's a hard one. I just to clean up for this, I moved like 300 pounds of books out of this room because I haven't got my bookshelf in yet. But I'm going to go right now with the Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth.
Oh,
All right.
nice.
That feels
Fantastic. All right. Well, you had 300 to choose from, so I'm glad you found one of them you liked. And last but not least is your favorite life lesson.
honestly, it actually comes back a lot to that book. Is it's knowing that it's good to have goals, but sticking too strongly to a plan is probably not going to go well for you. And it's trying to be happy every step of the way. I think is very important. Like
Nice.
it's just always be asking yourself like, what do I feel about this? Where do I want to go? And not let other people dictate things, not let your preconception of what people want dictate things. So that's been something I'm still trying to apply, but it's not always the most successfully, but it's up there.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us at the tank today with Ryan Gariepy, CTO and co-founder of Clearpath Robotics.
Thanks very much, Matt.